千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. As always, I want to extend my welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we are ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. Tao Te Ching, Chapter 2. So the chapter title for Chapter 2 is Observe the Manifestations, whereas in Chapter 1 it was Observe the Essence. Both essence and manifestations in the chapter titles for 1 and 2 are used in the ancient context. So these terms had slightly different but related meaning in ancient times versus modern times. Manifestations was something that the sages observed mindfully and without attachments. That observation is the first character, Guan. You will see later on in our discussion of this chapter that this is crucial and central to the way that the Tao sages understood the world and increased their wisdom. It is also the same sort of thing that we can do ourselves just by observing. Now, when I say observing nature, people would tend to think that I mean going outdoors, perhaps to a place surrounded by nature without a whole lot of civilization, looking at the mountains, the mountain streams, the forest, etc. I want to be clear in reminding everyone that human beings are part of nature too. Therefore, your observation of your fellow human beings is part of the overall observation of the Tao or nature itself. The Tao includes everything. And we don't have to look far to find elements of what most people consider nature within our immediate vicinity. Even a potted plant is an element of nature. Going outside the house, feeling the breeze, enjoying the sunshine, those are elements of nature. We're never that far away from nature itself, even as we live in the city or perhaps a small town. It doesn't matter where we are, we're always embedded in nature if only we have the eyes to see. So now let's talk about the observation of the natural manifestations of this world. Here we are looking at chapter 2, 17 lines, which previously we were able to divide into 4 sections. And the sectional divisions make a lot of sense if you are only looking at the length of the lines. And when you add repeating characters, for instance, in the second section, you can see a repeating character that is always next to the last character in those lines. And most of those lines are 4 characters in length. So that makes it easy to figure out where the divisions are. You can see section 2 is obviously different from section 1. Section 1 has 2 much longer lines. So we were able to cover roughly half of this chapter. We talked a lot also about Wu Wei, which is the Tao principle of actions without attachments. In line 10, you'll see that being mentioned, the sages will manage the work of detached actions. And detached actions are, of course, actions without attachments. And part of that is the teaching of no words. That's the line right next to it. So we were able to get this far. And we also tie this together with the previous chapter, observing the essence. That observation is also without attachment, and the two are meant to be linked together. That is to say, detached observations will lead to detached actions. Detached observations provides accurate insights. Detached actions provide optimal results. And that is one of the recap slides that I have here. This is how we apply the principle of Wu Wei, starting out with observation. Observations can be made with plenty of attachments, all the way to no attachments at all. The more attachments we have, usually manifesting as desires, we want things to come out a certain way. The more we have that, the less accurate of our observations. Classic example is that if you look at the world with preconceived notions, you begin to find evidence to strengthen your belief. And that's because you started out with the conclusion and you try to reinforce that conclusion for yourself. We see that as a big problem today. In a world that is increasingly divisive, people belonging to different camps are definitely doing the observation with a lot of attachments. They are looking for evidence to back them up. So starting with prejudgment, a lot of attachments leads to inaccurate results. So we definitely want to look for the essence of things by looking within to gain the insider view. And we can do that by observing without attachments. It is what it is. Reality should be perceived without facade, without obstruction. So once we gain the valuable insights from detached observations, that can lead into action. So I say that it can, not that it must, because when you have accurate perception into a situation, it is possible that you will conclude that it's okay to let the situation continue to evolve on its own. In which case, the only action that you will take is continuing observation. You don't actually need to interfere. You just need to take a look to see how it continues to unfold. So that is the case where Wu Wei can be non-action. But there are also plenty of situations where your observation tells you that something should be done. Maybe not a whole lot, maybe just a tap, maybe just a nudge, maybe just a comment, or just a look. Sometimes minimal action actually yields maximal or optimal results. So that is the wisdom and intelligence of Wu Wei, that it doesn't keep you from seeing the possibility that you may not need to do a whole lot at all, and you can help the situation right itself. Now, of course, there are also situations that call for more. But as long as you are guided by your detached observations, you can undertake the actions with detachment as well. That's the bottom part. Acting with optimal efficiency. So this means perfect understanding leading to perfect movements, perfect actions leading to perfect results. Usually in the Tao context, we say that it's the actions that are precise and that includes just exactly what is needed and not one iota more. Minimal actions delivered gently, softly, and with positive intentions and compassion. So that's the application of Wu Wei that we talked about previously. Now, one important thing that I mentioned last time was that the concept of Wu Wei is actually all over Eastern thought. It's actually not unique or special to the study of the Tao. When Buddhism in ancient times, hundreds of years after the time of Lao Tzu, when Buddhism spread from India to China, the ancient scholars at the time needed to transcribe and then translate the sacred text from the ancient Buddhist tradition, and those were originally written in Sanskrit. As they attempted their translations, there were specialized terms that they needed to render into ancient Chinese. So one complementary pair of concepts was what is translated into English as conditioned dharmas and unconditioned dharmas. In ancient times, ancient Chinese scholars found that the best way to translate unconditioned dharmas was Wu Wei, and therefore its complementary opposite, actions with attachments, that could only be the conditioned dharmas. So the words of the Buddha, the teachings of the Buddha that were recorded in the Diamond Sutra were translated with those concepts in mind. And therefore, the Diamond Sutra says the Buddha talked about conditioned dharmas, saying specifically that all conditioned dharmas are like dreams, illusions, bubbles, shadows, like dewdrops and lightning flash. They should, as such, be observed. The interesting thing here is that Buddha, in ancient times, not knowing anything about the Tao tradition or Tao teachings, managed to say exactly what the Tao teachings were trying to convey at around the same time. Conditioned dharmas, actions with attachments, they are transient, they're temporary, and they are seen in Buddhism as illusory because they come and go. They don't last. They have no lasting reality. They should, as such, be observed. Well, that's exactly the main title of this chapter, is to observe the manifestations. And when Lao Tzu wrote this, observing manifestations, he was definitely talking about manifestations in the material world, the manifestations that are transient, that are impermanent, that don't last. Exactly like the examples, analogies, and metaphors used by the Buddha here. So that's an interesting correspondence between the Tao and Buddhism that I think doesn't get a lot of attention. So we explored that, and then we brought it back to this particular chapter. This chapter starts out with beauty as one manifestation in the material world. As I said, we're strongly affected by that because we're all physical beings. And yet, we also know from observation that beauty fades with age. At least physical beauty does. Spiritual beauty, inner beauty, that can last forever. So there, we have an indicator of which one is congruent with the Tao, which one to cultivate, regardless of to whatever extent of physical beauty you happen to possess. It's the same thing with other aspects of the material world. Money, fame, power, pleasure, all of those things are exactly as the Buddha said, like dreams, like lightning flash, like dewdrops that evaporate in the morning. They come and they go. And yet, we spend so much time and energy chasing after these things that don't last. Of course, the Buddha was also wise enough to recognize that we all need some material resources in order to survive in this world. So he was not opposed to that, but he wanted to pull people back from the obsession, the attachment of chasing after material things. This is exactly what Lao Tzu was trying to do as well. So I quote his lines here toward the bottom, where Lao Tzu wrote, "The sages managed the work of detached actions." The sages did not get tied up with desires for material things in the material world. They focused on detachment from that so they can work on what is real, the Tao. So the Buddha was not the only correspondence that we talked about last time. The other one was Confucius. And what I said was that I knew people would think of this as perhaps a little odd, because in the West, there's a sort of the academic notion that Confucian teachings are diametrically opposed to the Tao, whereas the Tao is free-flowing, emphasizing personal freedom. Confucian teachings are seen as restrictive, dogmatic. So I'm here to say that those are misconceptions. Both Confucius and Lao Tzu before him learned from the same source. They were students of the same school. And legend has it that Confucius considered Lao Tzu to be his teacher, his master. And here's what he said about Wu Wei. Here's the comment that he made about Wu Wei. He said that those who used Wu Wei to govern was Sun, not the only one. What did he do? He sat facing south with reverence. That was all. Now, this particular passage is full of cultural context and historical references, so you have to know a lot more about the time of Confucius and before to really get what he was trying to say. Sun is Emperor Sun, a ruler who lived 1700 years before the time of Confucius. Emperor Sun was known as the emperor who understood the principle of Wu Wei. In exaggeration, Confucius described him as he only sat facing the south, which meant that he sat on the throne of the emperor, the imperial throne, customarily always facing directly south. And then also in exaggeration, Confucius said that was all he did. But what he meant, we know from commentary, from subsequent expansion on these ideas associated with Wu Wei. We know what he meant was that this notable emperor, he did not govern using excessive laws. Instead, he set an example for people to follow. Here's the distinction. When you govern with attachments, that's the opposite of Wu Wei. It is bad governance. You impose laws, regulations. You punish people for what not to do. That's deterrence. That's the negative approach. Wu Wei is always the positive approach. It's the complementary opposite of acting with attachments. So that's good governance as well. The ruler, like this legendary emperor, sets a positive example for people to follow. This is showing people what to do, the positive approach. And the result of good governance in this manner is that there's not the busy work of managing the numerous laws and regulations. There's the smaller and more efficient governance. People have a better time. They don't have a whole lot of complexity to deal with. So the emperor, the officials, the people, the subjects of the empire, everybody can focus on the more meaningful work of improving the empire. So Confucius said, was this particular emperor not the only one? This is because the wisdom of Wu Wei is rare in the world. Most people go about their work in the opposite direction. That is, they did everything with a lot of attachments. They set up a lot of rules. They did everything not in accordance with the Tao, but completely opposite to it. So when we talk about practical applications, applying this to our lives, I wanted to go back to this table here. We ended on this last time. The table here listed the 3 different contexts where the Tao can operate. Now, the Tao operates in every other context imaginable, but these are the 3 that are the primary examples that we used. What Lao Tzu wrote was along the top row about the kings and emperors of ancient kingdoms and empires. They could rule with plenty of attachments. That is a focus on the negative, as in restrictive laws. That is a focus on quantity, things that are transient, like the amount of treasury, the amount of funds, tax collected, and how luxurious the palace could be made. The size of the army, how many soldiers, those are all quantities, those are all transient. Now, the complementary opposite, the way of the legendary emperor spoken of by Confucius, was the focus on quality, the focus on positive, without attachments, without excessive rules and regulations. So as you can see here, it's all about building, being constructive, focusing on prosperity, justice for all, safety, security, leading by example. And the results, it is important to note that you can get the best possible results by using the effortless Tao of Wu Wei. Everybody, everything comes into alignment. The kingdom, the country, the empire enjoys prosperity and increasing power as well as influence. And you can easily map that to the modern context of a company, like a business or organization, where the leader of that organization, here I've got the CEO, the chief executive officer, that person, like the king or the emperor, can be focusing on the numbers, the rules, the negative approach. Those, again, are just absolutely transient. And the wise CEO will be taking a lesson from all of this and leading the organization with the positive approach, leading by example, focusing on quality for the employees, the clients, the customers, the suppliers, the vendors, everybody. Focusing on service and communication, building this essence of the company, improving upon it, because the essence of the organization, that's what lasts. Nowadays, we may say that, oh, that company has a great company culture. Well, company culture, that's intangible. It manifests in the way people act and react, treat one another. It is not something that you can touch or hang on to, and yet it's a powerful force within the organization. So in a similar way, this leads to positive results, which in the case of a company that's profit-driven, it leads to greater prosperity, just like the kingdom, but increasing business, positive word of mouth, and more prospects. And ultimately, we want to take note of those examples and apply them to ourselves. We too act in the role of CEO, the king, the ruler, the emperor, to the little kingdom, the organization that's our lives. So this is absolutely congruent with what the Buddha was talking about. The Buddha said, don't spend so much time and energy being attached to all the things that come and go. And that includes, as you see here in the negative approach, that includes money, position, possessions, and the things that you complain about. Complaints is probably one of the biggest manifestations of using this negative approach in life. So how should we live instead? How can we live with Wu Wei? As you can see here, I want to further highlight the last two squares in this table. The idea is to focus on spiritual and physical well-being, to learn more, to challenge the mind, to establish a personal code of honor. So these are things that are intangible, and yet these are the positive aspects of life. These are the things that enable you to set an example for others, whether that's friends, coworkers, your children, family members, etc. The positive results that this leads to, and this is time proven, time tested, positive results, increase refinement, spiritual refinement of yourself. You begin to radiate this natural joy. This is infectious. Other people who come into contact with you, they cannot help but feel that same sense of joy, and they may become curious and ask you, well, how are you doing what you're doing? And if you share the Tao with them, that could be part of your purpose in this existence we call life. We ended on this note last time, and I think now we're ready to move on to talk about the remainder of Tao Te Ching, Chapter 2. We're now on to line 12. Line 12 says, they work with myriad things, but do not control. They is a reference to the sages. What the sages do, as we talked about, is that they observe nature with detachment. They note that the Tao slash nature nurtures myriad things, but controls no one and nothing. They also then turn their observation to, as I mentioned, the other aspect of nature, which is human beings. They observe how human beings act. And even though we're part of nature, we know from experience that oftentimes our actions, our thoughts may not conform to what nature does. This is because of the human mind, which can be a blessing and a curse. The human mind, if fixated on material things, will be acting with a lot of attachments. If the human mind is aligned with the human spirit that is detached, the human mind can be acting without attachments. But as I mentioned, Wu Wei is rare. So most people may not know it. And people who do not know the Tao may act against this natural flow. This flow we observe out in greater nature. And the people who act against it, you know them, you see them. They're known to be bossy. Haven't we all seen people like that? The bossy ones cannot suppress a need to order others around, to manipulate them, to get them to do certain things in a certain way. Oh yeah, you know who they are. You've seen them. Now, people being bossy is actually level 1 in 3 different levels. When they get even more bossy, and they're bossy all the time, they may be described as backseat drivers. These are the ones who keep telling you what to do, even when you know which way to go. Backseat drivers will still insist upon directing you at every turn. They will tell you to slow down or speed up, and their inability to stop is linked to their inability to trust. So we're beginning to identify the underlying reasons for this kind of behavior that is opposed to the Tao. I mentioned there were 3 levels. What's the worst level, the 3rd level? Well, those are the people that we call control freaks. Sometimes, in more polite terms, we say that they are controlling, they have issues with control. The most contrary to the Tao. It goes beyond backseat driving. Metaphorically, it's like the backseat driver is reaching across, grabbing your arms, making you steer in a certain way as if you are a human puppet. This is the person who not only looks at what you're doing on the computer from behind you, but also reaches across to tap out the keys, like, hey, just do this and this and this. Press this button and then do it this way, and let me type this out for you. That is very alienating. In general, controlling behaviors alienate everyone. Somebody at this extreme level of controlling behavior ends up alone because nobody is willing to get even close to this person and be subjected to this kind of unpleasantness. So let's continue on. What else can we say about line 12? Controlling behavior that we're talking about in the 3 different levels, always rooted in fear. And there are different kinds of fear that can lead to controlling behavior. Fear of failure. So people who interfere with what you're trying to accomplish, they're probably thinking that, well, if I let people do things in a way that I do not approve, we're going to fail. So the fear of that motivates their actions. There's also the more generic fear of losing control. They want everything to be done the way that they want it, in that very specific way. They do not trust other people can do a good job, adequate job. They don't even believe that other people may be able to do a better job than they can. So because they fear losing control, they re-exert control. And here's the big one. The last one is big, and that is the fear of being abandoned or betrayed. This is exactly what can cause people to be alienated and not even get near. They will say, they will think, that's it. I can't take any more of this. I'm out of here. So fear makes one anxious, and therefore the need to alleviate that anxiety is exactly the need that leads to controlling behaviors. The fears we're talking about can also turn into paranoia, such as, all of you, you're all against me. And that is the beginning of even more problems. We definitely see characteristics of something like this associated with the worst people in our lives. There's the characteristic of insistence, like they insist on doing things in that particular way. There's the characteristic of inflexibility. They don't want to consider any alternatives. And even when it's a small issue, that's really just a personal choice. They still want to get all up in your business. They may refuse to back down, even after you make it clear that you disagree with them. So, overbearing, perfectionist, demanding, this is all part of that. This is why so many people continue to fail time after time. And this is observed by the sages. The sages will say, in that domineering, controlling behavior, they go against the Tao. They fail in life in so many different ways. They fail in terms of the work they want to do, projects they want to complete, goals they want to achieve. They fail at doing all of the above. They fail also in terms of personal relationships. As I mentioned, it's incredibly alienating. It's incredibly off-putting. It turns people off. People don't want to be close. People want to get away from the control freak. Because of this, the sages turn their gaze to the other direction, not most people, but the process of heavenly creation. They note that in that process of heavenly creation, the Tao seeks control over nothing and no one. Therefore, the sages, in emulating that, they also seek control over nothing and no one. but only themselves. So I want to depict this with an imagery. So this is depicting the sage observing nature. There's the mountain in the distance, there's a forest nearby. The observations of the sages. This is the slide that I want to use to graphically summarize what we have talked about. They look at nature, they note that the Tao creates, sustains, and provides for all living things, and yet has no need to control any of them. This is different from the concept behind many deities that we know in human cultures. There are times when mythology and religious figures will say that the deity wants to control the world. There are also times when the religious teaching is that the deity wants to let people choose for themselves. So what the sages observe in nature is definitely closer to the latter, that the deity, nature, is leaving it up to individual human beings to make up their minds about what to do. Nature, the Tao, is not imposing any mandates as to what to do. So they're similar in that way. Second point, the Tao is effortless in its functions. It doesn't expend a lot of effort the way that human beings do when we are trying to accomplish something that's a highly desirable goal. We're very stressed because we put in so much effort and energy. The Tao, nature itself, is always without the exertion of strife or struggle. But the Tao always succeeds in the end. The Tao wins out in the long run. Noting this, the sages compare that to what they see among human beings. They see that when people suffer from fears and anxieties, they often try to control everything and everyone. This is the exact opposite of what nature does. So this is something that's of special interest to the sages. Then, in terms of success or failure, the sages also note that most people struggle for more and more control, but still end up with more and more failures, like the opposite of what they want. Then, out of this, the sages conclude we can all live a lot better by being closer to nature than most people. We can also live our lives in that effortless way, not trying to control anyone, being harmonious with everybody, and have a much better life, a much more successful life by any metric, by any measurement. As we continue with this chapter, I think you will notice that observation of nature, learning from the Tao, is a recurring theme. It's a thread that weaves in and out of this particular chapter. Let's go to the next line. Line 13. They create but do not possess. Here again, the reference they will be the sages. Create has two different contexts within the Tao. There's the create as in creating something, and it could be tangible or intangible. You could be, for instance, creating a work of art. You could write a book. You may also come up with a new idea, a thought, a different way to look at the world. So create is covering not only crafting, but also being innovative. That is, create can include being creative. And that is what the sages are. They are creative in creating different things in life. And they can be creating, for instance, a personal connection with someone else. They can be creating an understanding among people of a Tao concept. Whatever it is that they create, characteristically, the sages think outside the box, especially when the sages are called upon to resolve a dispute. They can be creative there. What they create in that process is peace and harmony. So generally speaking, the sages are able to come up with innovative solutions, whether it's an invention or an idea. The sages are able to be creative because they tap into the Tao. The Tao is a source of never-ending, constantly flowing creativity. Knowing how to tap into it pretty much guarantees that you will never run out of this good stuff. And this quote unquote good stuff are the good things that benefit all. So just in case you are wondering, where do all these slides come from that we talk about every week? Sometimes every other, sometimes skipping weeks, but we talk about this frequently. Well, all of these ideas and concepts, these are all the results of tapping into the creative wellspring. That is the Tao. Now, regardless of what the sages create, tangible or intangible, things or ideas, connections, karmic consequences, whatever it may be, the sages are not possessive of that which they create. They much prefer to share the benefits of the Tao far and wide. So when I come upon this understanding of the Tao, I definitely do my best to try to emulate it. I too want to share the benefits of the Tao with everyone. So if anyone is wondering, how can something like this be offered to the entire world free of charge? Well, in this slide, you are looking at the reason. I not only want to talk about the Tao, but I want to practice what the Tao preaches. Let's continue on to line 14. Line 14 says, they act, but do not presume. So they, again, of course, means the Tao sages. Tao sages take action, but they do not presume because they are humble. They practice humility. They refrain from being presumptuous. The first part, though, that they act is important. It's one of the clues that we have that Wu Wei does not mean to do nothing. The depiction of the sages in the Tao Te Ching is that of a dynamic individual, someone who gets things done, sometimes in ways that are seamless, not obvious at all, but they do take action. They are not passive, they are not apathetic, but whatever it is that they do humbly. And in not being presumptuous, the sages observe what is proper and appropriate in any setting. So typically, in a social setting involving other people, there are norms that everyone will just naturally observe. So the sages are humble in that they don't consider themselves to be above the social norms. They want to follow the norms as people do and not stand out. So that is why The sages will not, for instance, dress in a very odd way, unusual way to draw attention to themselves. They prefer instead to be plain and simple to more easily blend in with the surroundings. So the sages succeed in all aspects of life, materially and spiritually. I actually want to emphasize this because there's always the notion that the sages are spiritually powerful, but then they may be materially not not obsessed with getting a lot, and therefore they have little. So I want to say that's a misconception as well. The sages, the real sages that understand the Tao, when they apply the Tao to the material aspects of life, they're able to do extremely well. They're able to engage in activities that bring about a lot of material abundance and prosperity for themselves and for the people around them. So it is not a contradiction to talk about a wealthy Tao cultivator. It may be someone who is applying the principles of the Tao, so the acquisition of the wealth is a benefit, not just for them, their family, but also for everybody who is associated with them. And when you come right down to it, the material aspects of the world are part of the Tao, no difference from the spiritual aspects. Of course, the sages understand how success, especially material success, can often go to someone's head. People who are doing well may assume that they are doing well because they are superior to those who are not doing so well. So this understanding enables them to remain down to earth. That's one measure of a true sage or a true master. Are they down to earth? Do they put on airs of being a master? If so, they're no true masters at all. If they are approachable, friendly, open, like it says here, down to earth, you can just talk to them. That's a good sign that they really understand the Tao. So we have talked about a number of concepts now, so I want to bring them into sort of a summary form using the same graphical elements that you have seen. Here in this slide, you can see that line 12, the sages do not control. Line 13, the sages do not possess. Line 14, the sages do not presume. So I want to bring those together in one slide, graphically summarizing them. The way of the sages, and remember, this is due to their observation of nature. The way of the sage is not controlling. The sages recognize fears. We talked about the fear of abandonment, the fear of betrayal, fearing the loss of control, fearing failure. They recognize these fears for what they are. The sages and Tao cultivators, in their moments of sagehood, they can see right through these fears and recognize that these fears are illusory. They are as temporary, as transient as the things that they're based on. If you fear losing material wealth, well, material wealth is transient. It's an illusory fear. Then, as the fears vanish, the associated anxieties also vanish. Hence, the sages have no urge to control anyone because they do not suffer from the fears or the anxieties associated with the fears. The way of the sage is also not being possessive. This is particularly true in terms of relationships with people. If you set them free, the sages believe, and they come back to you, then you know you have created this unbreakable bond of friendship that cannot be seen, and yet it is powerful, it is strong, it is based on mutual trust and respect. So, in other words, if we look at where we are right now, we're all engaged in this meeting. There is a bond among us. There is the connections that we all share. If that bond is strong, people come back again and again, even though they're not being forced to do so. So there's no way and no need to be possessive. The better way is to let go, to set them free. And lastly, the way of the sage is not presumptuous. And as I mentioned, there's a couple of aspects to this. I want to make sure that we cover them both. One is the presumption of superiority. The sages should not have any of that presumption, even though they may know the Tao better than most. The understanding, the insight is that, well, I may do well in certain things, but certainly not everything. Therefore, any feelings of superiority would be unfounded, not having a foundation in reality. Second, there is the presumption of certitude. What do I mean by that? By certitude, I mean righteousness, correctness, propriety. We definitely see this all the time now in our world, where people come into a situation feeling a lot of certitude about what they believe in, and they are not ready or willing to listen to any other perspective. The sages understand that what is right for me may not be right for someone else. The sages are self-possessed, so they have a very good idea what is right and proper and correct for themselves. Usually, they arrive at those conclusions very thoughtfully, and therefore, those opinions are not likely to change. It's something that they forged over time based on objective evidence from reality. But at the same time, they do not have the presumption of certitude in that they will not try to impose what they believe onto someone else. If other people are ready and receptive, they want to listen, then great. The sage will explain exactly how he or she feels about a particular topic. But if people are not ready to listen, it's just as well. The sages will just move on. So these are the three primary components in the way of the sage. Let's move on. Next line is line 15. And here we are looking at the last part of Tao Te Ching chapter 2. This is important. First, let me single out Gong Chen, the first two characters that you see there. Here's the pinyin on that. It's important to note that by the rules of pinyin, the first sound is not gong, like strike the gong. It's gong with the O sound. And then Chen. Let's take a look at what they mean. Gong means work. Chen means completed. So work completed. Work completed means the work has been successfully completed, objective is accomplished, success has been attained. The first character there, gong, that's actually the same character as the character for Kung Fu, Gong Fu. And that's because in order to practice Gong Fu, Kung Fu, a lot of work is required. It's the endless practice, it's the repetitions that turn certain movements into a natural flow so that you can call upon that particular movement when the need is present. When someone is attacking you and you know Kung Fu, the Gong, the work that you have put into it, will allow you to smoothly deflect that without even thinking. So that's work. That's the meaning in the term Gong Fu. Now, if I were to reverse these two characters, instead of Gongchen, I have Chen Gong. That's actually modern Mandarin for success. So that's a straightforward translation, but the ancient context is similar. You reverse the characters, still means the same thing. So the sages, like everyone else, they too have goals and tasks. They have things they want to accomplish. They have goals they want to achieve. They too have a journey that they are on, just like we do. The difference between them and everybody else, or I should say most people, is that the sages use the Tao to succeed. And when they use the Tao, just like nature, they seem to succeed in ways that appear to require no effort at all. So with these last two bullets, let me just mention one thing. There is a mistranslation of the Tao Te Ching that says, because he has no goal in mind, everything he does succeeds. That is actually a complete distortion. It is not some sort of profound wisdom to let go of goals. People seem to like this mistranslation because it seems to be so different from the mindset of goal setting. But the original says something completely different. The actual Tao is not rejecting goals. There's a lot of goals in the authentic Tao teaching. It's only talking about ways of accomplishing those goals like nature, effortlessly, without strife. Let's look at the entire line. They succeed, but do not dwell on success. What does it mean to dwell on success? Well, the sages, again, look at nature to see what nature does. They noted that nature accomplishes its work effortlessly without fanfare. It doesn't draw attention to itself. Nature goes about its work in a very practical way. The work gets done. Nature then will move on to the next task without delay. Nature doesn't sit around to wait for people to notice that something has been done. Once the flower blooms, nature moves on right away, does not stick around to showcase how beautiful the flower is. To dwell on success for human beings is to lose present moment mindfulness. And when you lose your present moment mindfulness, success is always in the past. You are no longer living in the present. You are dwelling literally in past success. And people who study spirituality, eventually they come upon a truth. The future is more interesting than the past. That may seem simple, but think about how many people relitigate the past endlessly, dwelling on the past, whether it's success or perhaps some sort of dispute. They want to live in past glories in the case of success. In the case of past disputes, unpleasant conflicts, they want to keep going back to that, to keep going through the case over and over again. Either way, it's not a good way to live one's life. The past is done. There's nothing we can do to change it. We say the future is more interesting because the future is a chapter yet to be written. It is where you can create a new and different result, a result that perhaps is better than the past. Let's go to line 16. Line 16 says, it is because they do not dwell on success. So basically, we're saying there is an important lesson to not dwell on success. Because, as I said, dwelling on success is to live in the past. Why do people live in the past? It can be a form of escapism. If people are not doing so well in the present, that is, there's a lack of success in the present moment, in your present situation, then people want to dwell on past success. I get that. I can only suggest that it is harmful to do so. Even though I understand the reason for doing so, I can't recommend it. It is also possible that perhaps one particular individual perceives a lack of prospects in the future, like everything seems hopeless, and therefore this individual would rather dwell on past success, to dwell on the success of the past. But here's the problem. No matter how hard we grasp onto past glories, the past slips away. We can indulge in nostalgia, but it doesn't stick around. It fades away. We eventually have to face the present. To dwell on the success of the past may be gratifying to the ego temporarily, but that's transient. That gratification will not last. Now, we're ready for the last line, line 17. Line 17 says that it never goes away. It's referencing success. The success never goes away. Tao masters, looking at these three lines, will use the river to explain this final point from Lao Tzu. First, 成功, the success. Translated as they succeed. The river flowing across the land has succeeded in nourishing all the plants and animals that it comes into contact with. They draw from the water provided by the river. They're nourished. They are successful in getting that water, that all-important water for life to continue. So congratulations to the river, you have succeeded, but the river, number two, does not dwell on success. The river doesn't wait around to flaunt. It doesn't say, everybody, look at how I have given water to the plants, to the animals. Look how great I am. It doesn't do that. It doesn't care, like human beings would, of perception, image, reputation. The river continues to flow across the land, it does so without delay. And then number 3, it's because of that it never goes away. Its benefit is everlasting to the myriad things. The myriad things continue living, thriving, because it now has a source of water. It will return to the river many, many more times. And this is the reason why the success is everlasting. There's a point that I want to make here, and it would be best to illustrate this point with the same graphical method that we've been using. And here's what it looks like. Observations of the sage of the flowing river. As we have seen, the river flows across the land, nourishing everything it encounters. We definitely get that. We can see, every time we see a river, we see that happening. The river keeps flowing, does not stick around to dwell on its success. It just keeps going. It doesn't stick around. Then, this success lasts as long as the myriad things continue to flourish. It's best to understand this final point by talking about what happens if the river stays in a particular place to dwell on its success. What if this is not the case? What if the water flows to a particular place and stops? The myriad things have taken the water, success attained. But then what if the water then doesn't move on? Well, that's exactly the metaphor that is used to depict water that has become stagnant and stale. We definitely see this occasionally when we hike across the forest. We can see pools of water that have gathered, but it is not part of a flowing stream. It's just sitting there. It has become stale. It's stagnant. It can fester because it is no longer fresh water. Now, in your hike in that forest, do you dip your cup into the stagnant water to take a drink from it? That would not be advisable because the stagnant water has become unfit to drink. So the success that the water had upon initial arrival, when it was still fresh and can be nourishing, that success no longer exists. It is not a success that lasts. So that success initially has become stale. And that is the point that I wanted to make with this particular graphic. It makes it clear that in order to continue the success, you must remain dynamic. Continue to live and move, take action in accordance with the Tao, and not stick around to dwell on anything. Now, we have seen the sages exemplifying the Tao in multiple ways now. And we have seen how it's tied together from the beginning of this chapter to now, to the end. We can now tie together everything, all the concepts, in order to summarize what we have learned from this chapter. I've put a table together here. I want to point out that the two columns that you see on the right, the center column and the rightmost column, these are the complementary dualities. You can see the attractive and unattractive. This is referenced in line 1 of this chapter. In line 2 of this chapter, we get to the good, the kind, the not so good, the unkind. In other words, the positive and the negative. So that's another complementary pair. To the left-hand side, the leftmost column, I have references from the chapter itself. So the first row is the first line, when the world knows beauty as beauty. That gives rise to the yin and yang of that which is beautiful and that which is unattractive. The second line, the second row that you see there, when the world knows good as good, that gives rise to the duality of better, worse, better or worse, positive or negative. Then we can talk about the characteristics that we have seen. The third row talks about the sages not controlling, that the sages create but do not possess. The next row down below, the sages do not presume and they do not dwell on success. So let's talk about how we can apply that in reference to the complementary dualities. As we talked about, the sages have no need to control anyone, only themselves. So we can learn from that as well. Why do we need to control anybody or anything? We have to focus on refining, improving self-control, self-discipline, living by that personal code of honor, not be inconsistent in thoughts and actions. So that's the positive aspect of it. The column here under the attractive, you can think of it as characteristics of a beautiful soul, the soul of a refined, advanced Tao cultivator. Whereas the column on the right is going to be the unattractive, the things to be careful of. The complement of having no need to control anybody is having the need to control everything. So a lot of people may be fearful and therefore anxious and controlling. That's unattractive. That's negative. Let's talk about being possessive. Whatever the sages have created or nurtured, they will set free. That's attractive. It's a kindness to let things go, to let them spread their wings. The complement to that, unattractive, very unattractive. People that don't know the Tao may hold on to relationships and things with a death grip. So this is a kind of unattractiveness we all recognize. Sometimes we don't see it in ourselves, but we can see it in other people better. And this is why you oftentimes will hear people say, hey, look, listen, you gotta let that go. Let it go. And that's because so many people, so many of us have this tendency to just hang on, to grasp onto things and refuse to let go. Here, you can see that it's negative and unattractive. Let's talk about being presumptuous. Even before we get into it, you already know. Arrogance is not attractive. We all know that. We've all seen that. But being humble can be very attractive. Someone who's down to earth, self-deprecating, exhibits humility without self-degradation, is humorous in the self-deprecating humor, that person can be rather attractive. No arrogant presumptions. That's positive. So, like I said, the opposite, the arrogance, very unattractive. So the people who don't know the Tao may be lacking in humility. I would even apply that to us because we have moments of being arrogant or being driven by the ego, make presumptions that we presume. We forget the teachings of humility. So this right here, I'm hoping, is a reminder for all of us, myself included, how to be more attractive, how to avoid the unattractive in ourselves. So far, you have seen that it is much, much more attractive if we avoid being controlling, if we avoid holding on to things, refusing to let go, and if we avoid being arrogant. So lastly, it is positive and attractive to not dwell on success. Sages achieve a particular goal, move on to the next one, like the river, like nature itself. When we see the changes of the seasons, upon the completion of that change, nature immediately moves on to do the work of that particular season. The unattractive aspect of it, yes, people dwell on past glories. They remain stagnant in the present. So this is sort of like when you hear people talk about what they did before. Back in high school, I did so and so. Back in college, I was big man on campus. How attractive is that? It is not. So what we want to do is to watch all this and use this particular slide as a guide. So this, I think, the title of this slide, Cultivate Spiritual Beauty, this calls back to the first line. So this is also going full circle as well. Now, I think we're ready to move on to the paraphrase. So here are the 4 sections of Tao Te Ching, Chapter 2. Section 1 talks about beauty, ugliness, good, evil. Here is the paraphrase I want to offer for that. Every concept gives rise to its complement. There can be no beauty without something that is less than beautiful. Nor can there be goodness without something that is not so good. So that is section 1. Already you can see that section 1 is setting up the yin and yang dualities. Those dualities are emphasized in section 2. Section 2 talks about being, non-being, difficult, easy, long, short, high, low, and then it goes on to talk about music and voice, front and back. So here is the paraphrase I want to offer for section 2. When we observe the world, we see such complements everywhere. Existence and non-existence are 2 sides of the same coin. Difficulty and ease are relative and constantly changing. Descriptions like long and short, high and low have meaning only in comparison. Music and voice harmonize and take on characteristics of one another. When we understand all of this, we begin to see that in life, being ahead or behind can be a matter of perspective. So hopefully, when we render it like this in the modern vernacular, it makes this concept much easier to absorb. Now, we move on to section 3, which is talking about the sages, and that is going to continue on to section 4 as well. Section 3 introduces the concept of Wu Wei, the work of detached actions, leading to the teaching of no words. The teaching of no words, we understand, That means setting examples. So here is the paraphrase I would offer for that. This is why the sages live life in such an effective and joyous way. They manage their work without becoming fixated and overworking themselves. They demonstrate the Tao by setting examples for all to see. So that's section 3, paraphrase. Let's take a look at the last section here. It's continuing on to describe what the sages do. As we have seen, the sages are not controlling, they are not possessive, they are not presumptuous, and they do not dwell on the past. The important thing, the very last line, is that this is how to achieve everlasting success in the Tao, spiritual success in the Tao. So here is the paraphrase I would like to offer for the final section. They work with everything and everyone without trying to be controlling of anything or anyone. They create good things in life without trying to hold on to them in a possessive and proprietary way. They seek moderation in doing without overdoing and excelling without excess. They attain their objectives, but once they have done so, they detach and move on to the next thing. This is the secret of their success, seemingly effortless and continuous throughout life. So that is the paraphrase for the final section. I wanted to emphasize the effortless and continuous success by any metric in every area, every aspect of life throughout the entire lifetime. So having done the paraphrase, let's go ahead and complete the full circle for this chapter. In the last lines of Tao Te Ching chapter 2, Lao Tzu points out that real success does not dwell on itself, and that's how it can be lasting. So we have seen several ways of looking at that now. I think we all can see how that concept is applying to life itself and our role in this particular journey. So we can now link this back to the beginning to see how we can form that full circle. The beginning says the world knows distinctions by comparing complementary dualities. So how do we link success, lasting success, to complementary dualities? That is the question. This is basically saying success can be lasting or transient. That which lasts has the complementary duality of that which does not last. Things that are permanent versus things that are impermanent. Therefore, when we successfully complete something in life, that success can be lasting, or it is also possible to have that success slip through our fingers. How do we make sure that it is lasting and not transient? To be lasting is to be truly successful, and the only way we can do that is follow the teaching in this chapter to follow this path of the Tao. And I would quote that to manage the work of detached actions, to conduct the teaching of no words, that's the manifestation of Wu Wei in daily living. It is what will contribute to lasting success in our lives. So that is the message from the full circle. So let me move on to the summary for what we have talked about today. Indeed, the summary for the entire chapter 2 of the Tao Te Ching. We started out with the complementary dualities. We understand how to utilize that concept now. By going through chapter 2 in the way that we have, this is what I would call a complete understanding of the Tao Te Ching. We see comparisons and contrasts in complementary dualities, attractive, unattractive, kindness, malice. The world is full of them. Number 2, we begin to understand how long, short, high, low, and all other measurements, all other descriptions, big, small, heavy, light, everything. All these comparisons have meaning relative to one another. And something can be long in one comparison, but the same thing unchanged can be short in a different comparison. And number 3, knowing the above, we can choose the perspective that empowers us. Abundance or lack, it can lead to gratitude or it can lead to motivation. Ahead or behind, it depends on the way we look at things. There's always going to be those who are ahead of us, and there's also always going to be those who are behind us. In one particular group, we can be behind. In a different group, we are ahead. So that was from the first half. Then we covered the second half. I have the graphic here of the sage observing nature as a reminder for us to emulate the sage. First, just like the sages, we want to act without attachments. We want to have detached observation, to have understanding before taking detached actions. Look first, seek to understand before doing anything. Number 2, we want to emulate the sage's example to teach without words. That just means we must also set a good example for other people in our lives. So the idea is to focus on yourself. Focus on refining and improving yourself so that you can be an example for others to follow. Number 3, we let go of the need to control. Controlling someone is really a sign of distrust and also disrespect. So I would say when you let go of the controlling behavior, you are giving the gift of respect, the gift of trust. Number 4, there is no need to possess. We want to give the gift of freedom. Whatever we create, set it free. The connections we make, the relationships that we have crafted in our lives, we want to set them free. Give the gift of freedom. And lastly, there's no need to presume. Here I say, accept the gift of humility. This is a gift that we receive. To understand humility, to be humble, is one of the greatest gifts of all time. So this concludes our discussion of chapter 2 of the Tao Te Ching. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.